Good afternoon, students. We're going to discuss about the rise of nationalism in Europe. So, before we go towards the rise of nationalism, let's discuss the time period when this happened. So, immediately after 1848, there was a lot of changes in how European mindset you would react to political situations. Um, for this, you need to understand what happened during this period. All of you know that in the 11th and the 12th century, Europe was just being formed. They were just getting free of the Roman clutches, and now new kingdoms were being found. King James the First founded England, and then you had the Prussian empires and the Italian Empire, and slowly the rise of Ottoman empires. The Crusade Wars had just ended, and immediately after that, Black Death spread all across Europe, killing a lot of people. So after the Black Death, the period of Renaissance started, which was somewhat between the 13th and the 14th and the 15th century. And after Renaissance, then you saw that feudal lordship and monarchies were continuously rising. Now, at the end of all this, some things happened that changed the course of European mindset. One of those things was how the first French Republic was formed. We studied in previous chapters that how did the French Revolution happen, and how was King Louis XVI overthrown, and then we know how Robespierre took over the powers of France, and then when Robespierre couldn't deliver to the promises that were made in his name to the French public, the military general Napoleon Bonaparte then came back and set up a new French empire, calling himself emperor. Now all of this resulted into unification of thought process. Now what is nationalism to begin with? Nationalism is a thought process wherein you put your nation first. You identify yourself as members of a particular community through that nation. Like today, if I ask you that who are you, you will tell me that you are an Indian because you belong to the nation of India. Now you need to understand, just preluding this time, in Europe the mindset was more about what language you spoke, or which village were you from, what kind of feudal lordship were you a part of. So certainly they did not identify themselves as belonging to a particular nation. But this changed. Now what all happened? Let's see. In 1848, suddenly you could see that the feeling of nationalism started rising all across Europe. Whatever monarchies and foreign powers that were there, whatever foreign powers that had control over large tracts of land, they started delineating depending on the national cohesiveness that people felt. Now, what is national cohesiveness? How do you understand what a nation is? Here, some kind of homogeneity comes into picture. Now, let's not take the example of India because India is somewhat an antithesis to this particular idea. But in Europe, nationhood depended on some kind of homogeneity, like language. A lot of these nations that were formed were on the basis of language. So the Prussian Empire spoke German. The areas of Rhineland spoke German. The areas of Bavaria spoke German. So all of these came together under Kaiser Wilhelm I, who declared himself emperor of the whole German nation. He was the emperor of Prussia, but he had no control on lands that belonged to let's say Bavaria or Rhineland. But he took control over them, all because of Otto von Bismarck. Now, who is Otto von Bismarck? Otto von Bismarck was from Austria. He was a nobleman of Austria. And what he did, he realized that all these German-speaking regions could come together, and they could together form the country of Germany, the fatherland. Deutschland is what they used to call them. This is the word in German for Germany. It's called Deutschland. It is spelled Deutschland. So Deutschland came into being, and and Germany was formed under the emperorship of Kaiser Wilhelm I. Now, who did this? Otto von Bismarck did it. He planned it. He went to all the other heads of states and he came together, and an assembly was formed and an assembly was set up, and Kaiser Wilhelm I became the emperor of unified Germany. Now, before this, these people were divided into states of Prussia, of Rhineland, of Bavaria, but now they all came together as German nation. They spoke the German language, and that is why they belong to the country of Germany. This feeling of belongingness is what nationalism actually is. It signifies that you belong to this particular group of people, you belong to this nation, and you are a part of Germany. So they came up with a flag and they came up with the codes, and the codifices that they came up with realized them that they are now a part of this country. Can we please keep quiet? Like Germany, Italy was also unified. Now, Italy at that time was Rome, and then there was regions of Cyprus and Catalonia, and then there was Sicily, and the other southern Italy regions of Milan and all that, and Venice and all. Now, these were independent principalities. What were these? They were independent principalities, either ruled by feudal lords or ruled by dukes or something. Italy was also unified like Germany, and Italy also came under one king. And now when that happened, Italy also was unified, and they also identified themselves as members belonging to the Italian nation. Now, one of the reasons why this also happened is because of decline of papal power. Now, what is papal power, you will ask me? The Catholic Church is actually headed by an official head known as the Pope. He is called the Catholic Pope. Now, this person, the Catholic Pope, actually wielded a lot of political power as well in the past. And because of the political power that he held, he somehow became a pseudo administrative head as well, like a king. Even though he was not technically a king, between the ages of 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th century, and because of the Crusade wars that happened in the Holy Lands, papal power was concentrated in him. When people realize that religion and state is different, and they realize that they belong to Italy first and to Rome second. Rome was the seat of this power in Vatican. Even today, if you go to Rome and you go to Vatican city is itself, which is a part of Rome, actually it's in itself is a country. So they have independence from Italian and Roman laws, even though they are a part of Rome. So papal power, because it started declining, that was also one of the reasons why nationalism rose in Europe. Now, so Italy was unified, Germany was unified, Russia was unified, the Ottoman Empire was solidified, and these empires amongst itself, the French Empire and the British Empire, these empires and the Spanish Empire, these empires amongst themselves had somewhat divided Europe. So they were like, you had the Portuguese Empire, you had the Belgian Empire, you had the English Empire, the French Empire, you had the Prussian Empire, and you had the Italian Empire and the Russian Empire. Now, these 7 empires had divided Europe amongst themselves. But were they quite happy with just dividing Europe? No, they were not. These countries actually decided to colonize the other parts of the world, which they thought are not developed enough. And they also divided these parts amongst themselves. So you had Belgian Empire in Central Asian, Central African regions. You had the French Empire divided all across Africa and Asia. You had the British Empire in India and Burma, and in many other parts. You had French. Russia also had monopolies in Mongolia and Central Africa, Central Asian region. So all of these had colonies spread across everywhere. Now, how is that colony helping nationalism? I'll tell you how. Now, for example, if you were a citizen of Britain, you called yourself member of the British Empire. What did you call yourself? The member of the British Empire. And now when you were a member of the British Empire, the resources that the empire commanded, even in regions outside Britain, were yours. Like whatever resources that came from India, or that came from the South Asian region, or from other regions in Africa, or from other regions in America. Now all of this were commanded as yours. And because of this rise of colonialism, influx of raw materials were there in a continuous manner. There was a continuous influx of raw materials that was happening, and because there was a continuous influx of raw materials, industrialization was fueled. This is also the time when the industrial revolution of Europe had reached towards zenith. Can we please keep quiet? This is also when the Industrial Revolution had reached its zenith in Europe, and they were producing new goods and setting up new factories everywhere. Now, because of the setting up of factories everywhere, a new class of people were created. This new class of people is known as the middle class. And because this middle class of people was created, these people demanded to be identified as equal citizens, and that raised their concepts of belonging to as citizens of a nation, and they were very loyal towards their flag, towards their country, and that loyalty also increased the desire to be participants of growth of that particular nation. So the setting up of the industrial revolution, or the benefits of the industrial revolution and the benefits of the colonialism that had happened all across Europe, was also one of the reasons why nationalism was rising in Europe. Now, there was also one more factor that contributed a lot in the rising of nationalism in Europe. Now, what was that factor? That was the American War of Independence and the setting up of the free American region. Now, all of you know how America was formed. America was formed because a lot of people who we now call as pilgrims, they went and set up 13 different colonies in the then known as New World. And when they set up these colonies, the colonies slowly grew because of new people coming in. And all of a sudden, they realized that they don't want to be a part of the British Empire here as well, because that is what they were running from. And then they set up independent government, and then they had a war with Britain. And in this war that they had with Britain, the French supported the Americans. And when the American won this war of independence, they were able to set up their own free government. Now, because of the setting up of the American free government, a lot of patriotism fervor was seen in America. Now, this patriotism fervor that was seen in America was what the soldiers that fought against them for Britain or with them for France, they also brought these feelings back with them when they came to Europe. And then they explained these emotions, and they explained these principles of liberty, fraternity, equality to all their countrymen in these countries. And because they propagated all these emotions and all these feelings and all these principles, that also contributed a lot to the rise of nationalism that happened in Europe. Now, you need to understand that a lot of these European countries that were ruled by kings or emperors, they were somehow connected to each other. The whole Anglo-Saxon empire of even the House of Windsor or the House of Kaiser Wilhelm or the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, and all of these people, they were connected somehow because they always used to marry only amongst nobles. So that was a hindrance in rise of nationalism. So what they did, they somehow cut off their connections with rulers of other countries, and they themselves anglicized or Germanized themselves to show that they belong to that particular nation only. Now, because of there was a rise of nationalism, it also affected it also resulted into rise of fascism. Now, what is fascism? Now, what happens when a lot of nationalistic fervor increases, then that starts creating friction because of homogeneity of culture, and because of that being the reason why people belong to a particular group of or set of people then identify themselves only to be the member of that nation. Now there were non-German speaking populations that were within Germany, and they realized that German speaking populations treated them differently. Now why that happened? Because they realized that only people who spoke German or who belonged to a particular race should be a part of Germany. And because of this rise in bigotry and rise of fascism, this also was a byproduct or a side product of rise of nationalism. There was a concept amongst these countries that only those who spoke their language or only those who looked like them should be a part of this particular empire. Now, the the continuous growth of industrial outproducts, and because of the advances in sciences, war weaponry also rose. And because of friction found due to colonialism all across the world, and because of rise of nationalism, it created differences amongst nations. Now, when these differences were created amongst nations, it resulted into a point when even a small dispute between two nations could become a bigger problem. So very small wars or small battles or small skirmishes started happening between these countries, like between the Ottoman Empire and the Greece, between the Balkan regions, and also between Britain and France, and between Russia and Germany, and between Germany and Poland. Now, because of these continuous skirmishes, there was a lot of heated period that was going on. This was the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century. Now, you need to understand, these countries were powerful empires. They had colonies all across the world, so they had umpteen number of resources. There was no stoppage. There was no requirement, or how do I put it? There was not any problem of acquiring resources, and they had, because of the advances in industrial technologies, they also had access to a lot of weaponries. Now what happened is, because of all these problems, they created a hatred amongst nations. And because this hatred was created amongst nations, it was ending up into a lot of friction points. And all of this culminated when the First World War started, which was then called as the Great War. Now, how this happened is, Gabriele Principi, who was just a citizen of Serbia. Now, Serbia is a country in the Balkans regions. Now, he was a citizen of Sarajevo in Serbia, and this guy shot dead Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. Now, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was the ruler of Austria, and Austria and Serbia had not so great relations amongst themselves. They already had friction, and they already had threatened each other of war many a times before this. And even after all these frictions that they had, Franz Ferdinand had decided to visit Sarajevo. And this is where in Sarajevo, this individual, Gabriele Principi of Serbia, he shot dead Franz Ferdinand by shooting him 3 bullets. And that resulted into the start of the First World War, and by the end of it resulted into perishing of more than 25 million souls because of wars that happened between the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, the Italian Empire, and on the one side, and then the British Empire, the French Empire, the American government, as well as the Russian Emperor on the one side. That happened. So certainly, because of all these differences that had risen, or all these frictions that had happened, they resulted, or they culminated into this particular event, cataclysmic event that we now know as the First World War, and which also then laid base towards the setup of towards the Second World War, because the Second World War was basically an after effect of what happened in the First World War. So, rise of nationalism can be taken as a base point to understand how Europe changed from the times of the Renaissance to the French Revolution, and then because of the rise of nationalism, it created friction points that resulted into the First World War that we will study in the next chapter. And by the end of the First World War, Europe was not same as it ever was. The Ottoman Empire completely declined. Germany lost huge regions. Italy lost huge regions, and rise of Allied powers started to happen in the world. The First World War also gave birth to Adolf Hitler, which somehow then culminated into the Second World War. But this we will discuss in future lectures. So points to remember of rise of nationalism: it started in 1848. Germany and Italy were unified, and new kingdoms were made. Because of rise of industrial revolution and because of colonialism, there was a lot of raw materials that was available, and because of that, friction points started to be generated between these kingdoms, which then culminated into the First World War. If you have any questions, message me. Thank you, people.